بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله Alhamdulillah. This is lesson number 5, alhamdulillah, and usually when we study Aqidah, the science of theology, we spend a lot of time in the beginning talking about epistemology, or how we know what we know. And for many people, this is their first time hearing about this topic. But in many ways, it's kind of like learning the difference between poetry and prose. We say that poetry is metered language and prose is everything else. And we learn that we've been speaking prose our entire lives. Our daily conversations consist of prose. But we don't think of it as prose until we learn the distinction between poetry and prose. And it's in many ways similar when we talk about epistemology. We're learning how do we know what we know, what are the sources of knowledge. And once we learn it in this technical way, we reflect on our daily lived experience and realize we're making these judgments every single day, but we haven't always had them explained in this manner. But they have to be explained like this because we have to know the distinctions between the various ways of knowing, because ultimately the study of Aqidah, the science of theology, is about knowing, truly knowing, and not basing our beliefs on guesswork, on ignorance, whether it is simple ignorance or compound ignorance, or incorrect guesses, or following and parroting what we've inherited without a deeper understanding. And that's why when we study Aqidah in the beginning, we spend a significant amount of time on epistemology. How do we know what we know? Wasa'ilul ma'rifah, the means of knowing. And once we get through this discussion on epistemology and we go into the content of Aqidah, we see that it's a lot easier to understand, it's a lot easier to grasp. The arguments and the ways we analyze the content of our belief is much easier to digest after studying epistemology. So in our previous classes, after talking about the introduction to the science of Aqidah and looking at the 10 foundational matters that concern the science of Aqidah and every other subject, we looked into the dibaj, or the opening of the text, which has the basmala and the hamd and the salat ala nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We then looked at epistemology itself. We looked at what it means to know. We looked at the definition of knowledge, the general definition of knowledge, and the very specific definition of knowledge as it pertains to Aqidah. So we said that it is idrak, to have access, to attain, to reach an understanding. Idrak al-shay' ala ma huwa alayh, to have access to something as it really is. And we went further and talked about the definition of knowledge in the science of Aqidah, where the Imams say that it is to have jazm, to have conviction, jazm mutabiq lil waqi' an dalil, to have conviction that is congruent, that matches reality based on a proof, based on proof. And this definition excludes the things that are not truly knowledge, things that either oppose knowledge or at times even masquerade and stand in the place of knowledge that many people think is knowledge but is not. So we talked about the different categories. We talked about ignorance, simple ignorance, compound ignorance, and we talked about the true guess, where you get the answer right, but it wasn't based on true access to that knowledge. It wasn't based on any proof. In the example of what's in my pocket, if you correctly guessed that it was keys, you didn't really have access to that to have true knowledge, but you guessed. And the reason you guessed that could have been from prior experience, or just the chances are it was a set of keys, but you didn't have true access. And then we contrasted that with wahm, which is the incorrect guess. And both of them share in one quality. You don't have access. We talked about shak, which is doubt. And we talked about taqleed before, and we said that there's a difference between taqleed in matters of law and taqleed in matters of aqeedah, where in one it is required because we're not mujtahidun, the other is actually prohibited in matters of belief, because in belief it's not so complicated that you have to rely on the authority of someone else. You can't outsource your belief in Allah based on what someone else says. You have to know for yourself. And so we talked about, after establishing these things, we talked about the hukum and the importance of the hukum, the judgment. We said that the judgment is the hukum, the judgment is the claim, it is the assertion, it is the thing that we say about something else. It is ithbatu shay aw nafyuhu anhu. Ithbatu amrin li amrin aw nafyuhu anhu. It is to affirm one thing for another or to negate it therefrom. And we spent some time talking about that. This is really important because we realize in studying the hukum that any claim that we make, any judgment that we make requires a proof. If we say A is B, that is a claim. That's a hukum. That hukum has to be substantiated. If we say Zayd is standing, what is the proof? The proof can be very simple. My observation. I am seeing him standing. That is my proof. And one can argue about the proof, but there has to be a proof. What one cannot say is Zayd is not standing, and when asked for the proof, say, I don't have to prove it, you have to prove it. You're making a claim, whether you're affirming something or negating something, it's still a claim, and claims have to be proven. They have to be substantiated. And we said that this is important in the area of aqeedah because specifically with atheists make a claim. They say, God does not exist. So there's the A and the B in the claim, and in between them is the nisbah. There's the ascription between the two things. In this case, it's a negation. The negation of what? Existence. Whether it's an affirmation or a negation, it's still a nisbah, an attribution between A and B. That means that there has to be proof. There has to be evidence to support that claim. A person cannot say, as an atheist would, God does not exist, and when pressed for proof, they say, I don't have to prove it. You have to prove it. This is somehow the default position. It's not. They are making a claim and that has to be proven. Whereas the agnostic, we said, they're making a claim too, but it doesn't have to be proven in the same way, because what are they making a claim about? They're not making a claim about God. They're making a claim, a hukum, about themselves. They're saying, I do not know. So we'll take them for their word. That's an internal state. So they're negating knowledge from themselves. So that is a hukum, but it's about themselves, not about God. And we said that once they've made that claim about themselves, not having knowledge, they are no longer able to offer anything more to the conversation. They can't add any more things to that. They can't say, I do not know if God exists, and it's not important, and it's not knowable, and it's irrelevant. All these things they add on mean nothing. Once they've acknowledged they have no knowledge about that, what can they add? So this is the hukum, the judgment. Now we said that in our last class that we're going to cover two in particular with some detail, but ultimately there are three types of judgments. When we look at a judgment that is made, the ascription of one thing to another thing, or negating something from another thing, there are three types, broadly speaking. For us as Muslims, there's three types. The first type we all know, and it is called al-hukmu al-shar'i. Al-hukm al-shar'i, the legal judgment or the legal ruling. What is that? We said the definition of hukum is to affirm one thing for another thing or to negate it from it. So the hukum shar'i would be saying that A is obligatory, it's wajib, or A is not obligatory, or A is haram, or A is not haram, or A is recommended. So we have 5 different types of legal rulings in the Sharia, upheld by the majority. There are some details and some subdivisions among different ulama, but broadly speaking, there's 5 legal judgments in Islam. So, you ever hear people talk about Islamic matters and they say, this thing is not Islamic. You ever hear that kind of language? This is Islamic and that is not Islamic. This is very inaccurate. It's too broad, it's too general. We don't speak in that way, where things are black and white, Islamic or un-Islamic. These are not legal rulings. Is drinking a Mountain Dew Islamic or un-Islamic? We don't talk like this, because if there's nothing specific to support it, drinking a Mountain Dew, does that mean it becomes un-Islamic to drink a Mountain Dew? No. So we have a much more nuanced and detailed way of describing these things. So we say that every single thing a Muslim says, does, or believes in, or intends in their heart, is going to fall under one of 5 rulings. What are these 5 rulings? Everyone should know this. Wajib. The second one, so obligatory is wajib. Number 2 is? I can't hear you. Mustahab, recommended, number 2. Number 3, mubah, which is legally neutral. Number 4, makruh, disliked, offensive. And number 5 is haram, right? So broadly speaking, these are the 5 legal categories. Whatever you say, whatever you do, whether those actions are actions of your body, actions pertaining to your wealth, actions of the heart, things you say, things you omit on purpose, all of the different human interactions are going to fall under one of these 5 categories. And mubah is a hukum shar'i, right? And there's some really interesting discussions when you go further into the science of usul al-fiqh about the implications of that. But it means that even the mubah, the things that is legally neutral, is still a legal category. So going back to that earlier question, what was it about drinking Mountain Dew? We said people say Islamic versus un-Islamic. We said that's inaccurate. It is too broad. So the question about Mountain Dew, which is a very generic example. We don't say Islamic versus un-Islamic. We say, where does that action fall among these 5 legal categories? Is it wajib? No. Is it mustahab? No, because those require specific legal proof. Is it makruh? Maybe. Is it haram? Maybe. Is it mubah? The default is that it will be mubah because it's a worldly thing. However, when you go into the books of fiqh and look at the fatawa, you'll find different opinions about the legal status of consuming products that can have long-term health effects. Most of the ulama say it's mubah unless a person drinks it to the extent where it's going to cause them legitimate, discernible physical harm, in which case it becomes either makruh. If there's certainty about the physical harm, like poison, then it's haram. The point is, we have a more accurate way of describing things than the black and white Islamic versus un-Islamic. That's a hukum shar'i, and we're not talking about the hukum shar'i in this class, but we're just introducing it here. Okay. The second category, or the second type of judgment that we're going to talk about, is really important in the science of aqeedah, and that is what we call the hukum adi. Al-hukum al-adi is translated as the empirical judgment. The empirical judgment, we say, is hukum adi. Now, ada in Arabic means to return. We say ada ya'udu audatan, to come back, to return. And in English we call it the empirical judgment. What does it mean? Empirical means something that is observable, something that is tested, something that is determined to behave in a certain way through observation, through repetition, through experimentation. So we can call it the empirical judgment. We can also call it the scientific judgment, though because there's, in the philosophy of science, we want to be more accurate, we'll say empirical judgment. What is it? Imam as-Sanusi, in his Muqaddimat, he gives a definition for it. He says that the empirical judgment, we remember that the hukum is, the judgment is always the association between A and B. A is B, or A is not B. That's the hukum. So the empirical judgment is the to affirm or to deny a certain relationship or connection between two things. To affirm or to deny a relationship or connection between two things by means of repetition, takrar, and the possibility of delay. This is the kind of detailed definition of it. Going back to the Arabic, it's a lot easier to grasp, I think. If we look at the Arabic, ada is coming from ada ya'udu, audatan. So it means to return or to come back or to repeat. So it is a judgment that we make based on establishing a norm. Establishing a norm. We don't mean a moral norm. The moral norm is this is good, this is bad. That's a shar'i judgment. And we're talking about the cosmic norm, the norm that we establish in science, the norm we establish through observation of repetition and patterns in the world. It is the scientific judgment, the empirical judgment. This judgment is not based on revelation. What judgment is based on revelation of Quran and Sunnah? That's the hukum shar'i. The legal judgment is based on revelation. The empirical judgment is based on observation and sense perception. Hiss wa takarrur, and we say in Arabic. The hiss is the sensory perception, your eyesight. You observe it, either directly with your eyes or through instruments such as microscopes or telescopes, through hearing, through your sense perception, and through repetition. So you see something, you observe it with your senses, you watch it repeat, and as it repeats over and over and over again, you establish through that observation a norm, a pattern. That pattern, that norm, is called ada. Ada. Is the moon whole, or is it divided into two? That's the question. It's whole. Every time we see the moon, we see that it's whole. If we look at it through a telescope, we see that it is whole. It's not divided into two. That's the ada, based on observation and repetition. Every time we observe the moon, we see that it is a whole entity. It's not split open. It's not split into two. But does it always have to be like that? No. When it is observed to go against the norm, we call that kharqul ada, or the breaking of the norm. Another word for the breaking of the norm is a miracle. A miracle, whether it is the miracle that Allah Ta'ala gives to a prophet known as a mu'jiza, or a miracle that he gives to at the hand of one of those close to him that's not a prophet, called a karama. Either case, that is the breaking of a norm. The norm is broken, and that is a demonstration of that person's status, though not always, as we learn later on. But that's the breaking of a norm. So the miracle we call kharqul ada, the breaking of a norm. Now, it's a great mercy from Allah Ta'ala that we have norms in our life. And as we see that without the ada, there will be no sharia, there will be no existence on earth, there will be no way to actually live our lives. So, to look at ada in Aqidah, we're discerning between what is observable, the judgments we make from what we observe, versus rational judgments that don't depend on the empirical phenomena. So, looking at empirical phenomena, here's this phone. I don't have a stick. I could have brought one. If I take this phone and I drop it, I let go. Every time I let go, I notice that it drops. Through observation, whenever I release my fingers from the phone, it drops. I do this thousands and thousands of times, and I see it falling repeatedly. I have an inductive series of events, and through this, I can make a decision about the future. So I've done this 1,000 times, and I established that every time I let go of the phone, it drops. If I come tomorrow, or if I'm going to decide in the future about something regarding my phone, based on my past experience, I know that if I also release it tomorrow, the same thing is going to happen. So that's the hukum adi. I base my future decisions on what I have observed in the past about cause and effect. This is a great gift from Allah Ta'ala. That's how we have civilization. That's how we have human life. That's how there's a sharia. Without this, there's no sharia. Because, if you drop the phone and it turns into a butterfly and flies away, if that was your friend's phone, do you owe him for the lost phone? Right? So that's the hukum adi. I can drop the phone 1,000,000 times, it's still going to do that. However, am I absolutely sure that every time I let go of the phone, it's going to fall? Am I absolutely sure? I'm sure based on patterns, but I'm not absolutely sure 100% that it always has to be that way. In fact, we cannot say that it has to drop. Logically speaking, does it always have to drop? If we take the example of the staff we mentioned in the previous class. If you take a staff, a cane, a stick, and you throw it down 1 billion times, it'll land on the ground and you pick it back up. But are you absolutely sure that it's always going to fall like that? Does it have to happen like that every single time? No. Because we know that there has been a staff in the past that was thrown down. Quran, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah ta'ala asks Musa, Ma tilka biyaminika ya Musa? What is that in your right hand, O Musa? He said, هذه عصايا, this is my staff. أتوكأ عليها وأهش بها على غنمي ولي فيها مآرب أخرى. I use it to lean upon. I use it to herd my sheep. And that in your right hand. What does Musa mention? He mentions the daily uses of the staff. He mentions the causal relationship that he has with the staff. He uses it for this, he uses it for that. These are all things based on patterns. But then Allah Ta'ala tells him to do what? Cast it down. Al-qiha, to cast it down. And when he casts it down, this time it doesn't remain as a staff, it turns into a snake, a serpent. And when this happened, in the Quranic account, Allah mentions that Musa ran away from it. Why did he run away from it? Because he was used to a certain pattern. He had a certain relationship with this staff, and it had a certain pattern, and this completely broke that pattern. So that's frightening. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calmed him and told him not to be afraid. And then he said, سَنُعِيدُهَا سِيرَتَهَا الْأُولَى. We will return it to its previous norm, its previous seerah. Seerah is not just biography. The seerah is the pattern. The person's seerah is their life pattern. The seerah of the staff is the norm of the staff, which is it's a staff. It's used for different things. And there are other miracles that were established through the staff, that it displayed other miracles, but that's after this. So the hukm adi is the relationship that Musa had with the staff up until the point where Allah told him to cast it down and it turned into a serpent. That was the breaking of the ada, kharq al-ada, the miracle of Allah Ta'ala transforming it into the serpent. Everything that preceded it turning into a serpent is hukm adi. It's the ordinary observed phenomena, the patterns in existence. So ada is the daily phenomena of everything around us. And we take it for granted because we often think that it has to be that way all the time. It has to be that way. And what we mean by that is we think almost rationally that rationally it has to work the same way it worked yesterday and the day before. But the reality is, for us as Muslims, we believe that there's nothing daruri, there's nothing necessary about anything in the cosmos repeating its same mode of behavior. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can cause it to manifest in a different way if He wills. So causes and effects are linked. You have fire. If you light a match and set something on fire and put your hand over it, it's going to burn your hand. This is basic cause and effect. However, as Muslims, we affirm cause and effect, but we say that there's nothing that makes the link between cause and effect daruri, necessary. It doesn't have to be that way. The pattern, the norm, is that if you put your hand in a fire, it's going to burn. That's a norm. But it doesn't have to be that way all the time. There's nothing necessary between the cause and effect being linked in that manner. Are there other instances where people have been put in fire and they weren't burned? Yes. In the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he was put into the fire, when they put him in the catapult and he was put into this fire, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the fire, Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. Be coolness and be tranquility for Ibrahim. And this shows us that there's nothing that is necessary between the cause and the effect being linked. There is a linkage, there's a rabt, but that connection, that link is by the act of God. The link between cause and effect is not independent of God. It's not independent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is the belief that we have as Muslims. And Imam al-Ghazali has a lot to say about this in many of his works, in his Tahafut and other books. He talks about cause and effect. And this is one of those things that, once you learn it and observe it around you, it changes how you interact with cause and effect. On the one hand, you take cause and effect seriously, as you were before, but you have a deeper understanding of how cause and effect works. And you realize that, as we've mentioned many times before, the believer always has to see with two eyes. The eye of the outward, the zahir, the eye of sharia, law, the eye of cause and effect, and the other eye, the eye of the batin, the eye of haqiqah, the eye of knowing that none of these things are independent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, looking at cause and effect and empiricism, there's a really useful description of cause and effect by a British or English philosopher, David Hume. And he talks about the ada in a really useful way when he talks about empirical observation, or the observation of cause and effect. He mentions that there are three things in any observation we make of cause and effect. So let's take one example of cause and effect that's common in our lives. Who can give an example? Just anything daily. You turn on the light switch and the lights turn on. So you flip the switch and the lights turn on. Cause is, maybe you can make it a little simpler because there's a intermediary there of electricity. Let's say, drinking water quenches your thirst. Okay, good. That's a good one. Drinking water quenches your thirst. You're thirsty. Here's water. You drink it. That's the cause. And then the effect is the quenching of the thirst, the removal of thirst. He mentions that there are three things in empirical observation of cause and effect. The first one, and these are on the board, spatial temporal proximity. That's a fancy way of saying that there's closeness between cause and effect, both in time and in distance. So, the drinking and the quenching is the cause and effect is close, both in the time and in the space. Which is to say that when you drink the water, your cousin in Pakistan doesn't call you and say, my thirst has been quenched because you drank it. That's distance. And time as well. You don't drink it and then 5 years later say, oh, my thirst is quenched 5 years later. In basic everyday cause and effect, we notice that there is closeness between the cause and the effect. Now that closeness is relative, but there's still closeness in distance, closeness in time as well. We also see that there is order. meaning that the cause comes before the effect, not the other way around. You don't have your thirst quenched and then drink the water after. That's not how it works. It is the cause followed by the effect. So this is the order. And the most important one is the constant conjunction. The constant conjunction means that when you see a cause, the effect seems to follow. So you drink the water and you notice that the effect of quenching seems to follow. If you put your hand in a fire, what happens? It burns. That is called the rabt, the relationship, the causal connection. If we look at the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam, we know that Ibrahim was cast in the fire. This is the event mentioned in the Quran that describes a miracle. Ibrahim alayhi salam was placed in the fire, which means that there was physical proximity and there was order, cause, effect. However, the issue here is the conjunction was missing. The rabt was missing. The connection between the cause and the effect was taken out. Because so you put your hand in the fire, it burns. The fire is the cause, the burning is the effect. There's a connection between the putting your hand in the fire and your hand getting burned. But in the case of Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was placed in the fire, but the connection was missing there. That was missing. That's because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed to create the fire and make it cooling for Ibrahim alayhi salam. If you look at another example of constant conjunction, have you ever heard of Pavlov's dogs? The experiment of Pavlov. So he did this experiment where he would bring food to a set of dogs, and whenever he brought the food, he would ring a bell. And over time, the dogs began to observe this conjunction, the rabt, between the food and the bell. And for them, for the dogs, there became a causal connection between the presence of food and the ringing of this bell. And they would salivate. Their mouths were watering. So he, after establishing this pattern, this rabt, this connection, he then goes to the dogs, ringing the bell, but without any food. What happens? The dogs still salivate, proving that the dogs established a connection between the presence of food and the ringing of the bell. So that is what we call constant conjunction. So when we observe a fire and we put our hands over it, we observe a connection between the presence of fire and the presence of my hand over it and burning. So this is how we establish patterns, and that is aada. Now, we observe the aada because there is one who creates the link between the cause and effect. And the one who creates the link is Musabbib al-Asbab, the causer of all causes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What's important here is, after understanding what aada is to understand that it's really just the observation of connections that Allah creates at every instance. They don't have to be there. In fact, if Allah removes a particular connection and creates another conjunction, we'll have something different. We'll have coolness. Nothing is inherent within the fire that it has to burn. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates the burning. As we're going to learn in our aqidah, we can say that fire burns, but really what that means as a Muslim, when we say fire burns, we mean there's a causal relationship between fire and burning, but ultimately that is the act of God. We don't literally mean that fire burns independently of God. We mean that it burns and we establish the burning through observation, through cause and effect, But that linkage between the cause and effect, the one creating the linkage is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when He creates a different kind of linkage, that's the breaking of the norm that we call a miracle. And there's different kinds of miracles. Maybe even miracle isn't the best word always, because the breaking of norms observed around us aren't always good. Magic, for instance, is a breaking of norms, but it's not good at all. The Dajjal will do things that break the norms, but those are things that lead people astray. And some breaking of norms are miracles, and some are mu'jizat, meaning they're for prophets alone. There's different types of breaks with the empirical phenomena that we observe around us. So we have, in a simple example of heat, where you have fire as the cause, and then burning would be the effect. The linkage between the fire and the burning is the act of God. The Rabt, the conjunction, is the act of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It doesn't always have to be that way. Which means that if Allah ta'ala doesn't connect the cause and effect, nothing's going to happen. If Allah doesn't connect the cause with the effect, then it won't happen. So the norm is only a norm because Allah Ta'ala creates that norm. If Allah didn't create that norm, then it wouldn't be there. And when the norm is broken, we call that a miracle. But what is the miracle? The miracle is the replacement of the norm with something else that Allah wills. And this means for us that everyday phenomena, picking up the phone and dropping it and it lands, that is no different from a miracle. The miracle and the norm are both the acts of God. So the miracle and the norm are equal in the sense that Allah Ta'ala creates them. And this means that a norm is no less of a miracle than a miracle when the norms are broken. They're all the acts of God. Now, we get used to the ada, and there's a mercy in that. Because if we didn't have norms, we wouldn't be able to live our lives. If things weren't consistent, we wouldn't be able to function. We have to have predictability in order to function in this world. And without the ada, there would be no sharia, because the ada is cause and effect relationships. I can't say, using the phone example, if I borrowed a phone from someone, if I go into the parking lot and decide to do a cartwheel and the phone falls out of my pocket and breaks, I can't say to my friend from whom I borrowed the phone, sorry, your phone is broken, but I'm not responsible, because it is Allah who created the breaking of that phone. It doesn't always have to land on the ground. Allah created the connection between it falling and it breaking. I'm not responsible. No, you're still responsible legally because there's a norm. And the Sharia is based on norms. Right? You have a question? That's the breaking of the norm, right? The sun rising from the west is the breaking of the norm, and we have no way of knowing that the sun is going to rise from the east except through observation of the past. There's nothing that says it has to rise from the east. If Allah wills, it can rise from the west. That's the reality. So this is the empirical judgment. And the empirical judgment is the scientific judgment. Science is about establishing the ada, the norm, which is established through observation with the senses and repetition, experimentation, observation. That is the domain of science. Science is limited to ada, it's limited to empirical observation. Science as a field can never answer the question, why? It can only observe and make note of the observations through testing, through repetition, all of which are recorded through sense perception, our power of observation. Science cannot answer the metaphysical why. It can only answer within its own domain. There has to be something beyond the physical, beyond the ada, that explains the ada, that explains the why. And that's where we come to the next judgment, and which leads us into the study of Aqidah. Why are we learning about this in the science of theology? Isn't it about belief in Allah? Absolutely. But in order to study Aqidah, we have to know a bit about the world around us and how we know what we know, and the difference between observed phenomena and judgments that do not depend on Sharia, a law, or depend on observation. And these are the first principles. 1 + 1 is 2. Is that something that you have to observe scientifically under a microscope? No. There's no such thing. It's impossible for there to be a square circle. Is a square circle possible? Can you draw one? No. So it doesn't depend on empirical observation. We're not waiting on a scientist to say, I've done all the testing and have determined that there cannot be a square circle. That's the realm of the hukm aqli that we're going to come to. It's 11:50? Okay. So the hukm aqli we're going to have to spend a couple of weeks on because it's the most important of the three. Are there any questions about the hukm adi though before we move on? The empirical judgment. Now one of the things that I noted last class, and we'll note again, is most people, before they study this, they confuse between the empirical judgment and the rational judgment. And they don't intend to, it's just we're familiar with a certain way of speaking. And so if we ask the question, is it possible for you to pour out a glass of water and the water flows upward? Is that possible or impossible? So some people said impossible. And a lot of people think that if something is scientifically impossible, then it is impossible on the face of it. They fail to distinguish between what is rationally possible and what is scientifically possible, or what is rationally impossible and what is scientifically impossible. Is it scientifically, empirically possible for a person to travel through the seven heavens without being in a spaceship, without requiring an oxygen tank, and also come back the same night? Is that scientifically possible? No, it's not. Empirically, we say that is impossible because we have a certain understanding of physics, and we have tried different ways of getting people to the moon and to other places in space, and we observe there's a lot of challenges in that. So based on our observation of cause and effect, no, that would be scientifically impossible. But is it rationally impossible? No. It is absolutely possible in the mind's eye to conceive of a person doing that. There's nothing that makes that absurd. There's nothing to say that a person traveling through the seven heavens and returning the same night is equally as absurd as a square circle. There's two different categories altogether. So if there's no questions about the empirical judgment, we'll move on into the hukm aqli. But before we talk about the meaning or the definition, you had a question? He traveled through the seven heavens. Right. And that was the point in mentioning that example, because we know through revelation that that happened. And we don't need to give it a metaphorical interpretation, because there's nothing rationally absurd, there's nothing rationally impossible with that happening if Allah wills. This is not the same as 1 plus 1 equaling 7 or a square circle, right? So, and we're going to talk more about this now in the hukm aqli. The rational judgment. Before we can talk about the rational judgment, like we talked about the empirical judgment, we want to address a question. And the question is, why are we even bothering with this when we're studying aqeedah? Why are we learning about the mind and the difference between empirical judgment and rational judgment? Where is any of this in the Quran and in the Sunnah? Why bother with these things? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us to know. And He has also told us to use our aql, our rational faculty, our intellect. And this means that we have to know how it works if we're going to use it. So, when we're studying aqeedah, the first level in studying aqeedah is idrakud dalil. It is having access to the proof for that point of belief regarding Allah, His attributes, His actions, and regarding the prophets and messengers and the unseen realities. Idrakud dalil, comprehending and accessing the proof. So the comprehending actually precedes affirming or denying the content. Does that make sense? If we're talking about belief in Allah Ta'ala, we have to understand what it means to know, and that is having that access. So we're learning if what we believe regarding Allah Ta'ala is mutabiq lil waqi', is it congruent with reality? Is it congruent? Does it match the reality regarding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Our iman is not based on warm feelings, and it's not based on emotions. These are developed through a connection to Allah Ta'ala. But having a basic understanding has to be established first. If you ask many Muslims around the world, why do they pray? Many Muslims will say, because Allah wants me to pray. Allah tells me to pray. That's a good answer. That's a correct answer. But if you ask them, who is Allah? Many people in their minds have a conception of the divine that is very childlike. They often have an image in their mind. I remember teaching this some time ago, and a person came up to me after class and said, for my entire life, when I pray, I have had an image in my mind about what Allah looks like. Now, that image in the person's mind, is that mutabiq lil waqi'? Is that congruent with reality regarding Allah? Absolutely not, because Allah is absolutely unlike anything. So a person is praying to Allah Ta'ala and they have an image in their mind. So the object of their salat is this image, and that image is not congruent with reality. They're worshiping the image, and the image has been given the name Allah, and that is not Allah. So we have to come to a deeper understanding, and that is through learning aqeedah. But we start from the sense, the mahsusat, the things that we perceive around us. We understand their limitations and what they are, and that's our starting point, to look at the world around us and observe change, observe need, observe fallibility, and from observing the world around us, we understand, well, the Creator who originated all of this cannot have these qualities. Because if he had these qualities of the world, the creator would also require a creator, because he has the same qualities as creation. So our starting point has to be knowing how to think, to understand that there's a world around us, we are in the world, we exist, and we and the world around us have certain qualities, and the creator cannot have these qualities. And how are you going to understand? We said you start from the world and observing around you. How are you going to understand the qualities of the world? You understand it through observation. Right? Ibrahim alayhi salam, he never doubted Allah Ta'ala, but he communicated to his people in the form of certain rhetorical questions. He would observe the sun and the moon and would ask in a rhetorical way, as a way of disapproving of his people, Hada Rabbi, this is my Lord. He didn't say, this is my Lord. He said, this is my Lord, with that tone to his people. And when the sun would set, what did he say? He would said, I don't like those that set. What is he doing here? He's teaching his people a rational argument for why the sun cannot be God. Because the sun undergoes change, the sun is finite, it is limited, right? So you can't understand the nature of the world around you until you observe the world around you. And when you observe the world around you, what is the tool by which you make those judgments? What's the faculty by which you make judgments about the world around you? It's the aql. And I'm pointing at my head, even though the reality is the aql is located in the heart. But there's a connection, as the early Imams would say, between the dimagh and the aql. The connection between the mind and the intellect. The intellect is a faculty beyond the mind, but the mind is used in it. There's a connection. You cannot understand the nature of the world around you without that faculty known as the aql, because that's how you observe and make judgments about what's going to happen in the future. That's how you establish patterns and see the attributes and qualities of the things around you. Is the world around us with a beginning or with is it without a beginning, or does it have a beginning? It has a beginning. How do you know? How do you know that? Because we weren't here when the world was created. Someone said revelation. Well, it's established in Revelation, but it's not independent of Revelation. We can know that through the aql, even though we didn't observe the origination of the world, the beginning when it was first created. We weren't there. We're here. But we know that the world has a beginning. How do we establish that? It's through the aql, it's through the intellect. And in order to do that, we have to know how it operates, how it works. We can observe the changes around us. And with the faculty of the aql, we see the change, and we determine that anything that has a change has a starting point, has a beginning, which means that anything with a beginning requires someone who originated it, right? So that's aql. We are not making these judgments based on our senses. The senses are tools, but the aql is what gives us the judgment. So the hawas, the seeing and the hearing, the senses, they cannot give us that judgment. They're just the tools for observing. I see that the sun rises and sets. I see a pattern. I see from that pattern that is going to rise tomorrow. This is all through my sense of seeing. But the sense of seeing isn't telling me that the sun undergoes change. It's the mind, it's the aql, the intellect, which is telling you through the observation that it goes through change, that it has a beginning, that it stands in need. So these are judgments of the intellect, judgments of the aql. And we want to distinguish between what is observed through the senses and the judgments we make based on the intellect. And starting from there, how much time do we have? We're looking at the hukm aqli, the rational judgment. What is the aql? We translate the aql as the intellect. Sometimes people translate it as the rational mind. I like the word intellect better. And the word aql in Arabic means, in its original meaning, is to impede or to prevent. Al-mana'. You say aql al-ba'ir. The aql al-ba'ir is, returning the animal back to its grazing area. That's the linguistic meaning of aql. It is to impede or to hold back. And the aql, the intellect of the person with intellect, it brings them back to sound understanding and keeps them from straying. So that's the connection between the linguistic meaning and what it means here. But there's always a technical meaning for aql, like there is for other words in the science of aqidah. What is aql? The technical meaning of aql is known as jawhar latif تدرك به الغائبات بالوسائط والمحسوسات بالمشاهدة. I don't want to give you all of the details of that definition, but it's basically a subtle faculty, a subtle means of perceiving that comprehends universals and particulars, and concrete things and abstract things. Concrete things would be things that have matter. Abstract things would be meanings. It comprehends universals such as oneness, whiteness, blackness, largeness, smallness, and it comprehends particulars. The particulars would be the individual things. So that's a very broad definition for aql. The aql, we said, is in the heart, because Allah Ta'ala mentions that in the Quran. فَتَكُونُ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. In a few different ayat, it's mentioned in a similar fashion that the hearts are the source or the locus of the aql. There's a connection between the mind and the intellect. It's not that the mind is the source or the locus of the intellect. And it is passive and not active. The ulama say that it's like eyesight, in that it observes, eyesight observes what's around it. In a like manner, the aql observes the nisbah between different things. A is B. The aql is observing that nisbah, that the is or is not between so many things around it. It's observing, right? The aql is mentioned in the Quran in numerous places. The aql is praised. The aql is required to be accountable in the sight of Allah Ta'ala. A person is not accountable on the Day of Judgment if they are not aqil in this life. The non-aqil human being is mentally impaired, and the mentally impaired person is not accountable in Sharia. They're not accountable, they're not mukallaf, they're not legally responsible. When we look at the three judgments that we've spoken about today, here I have it on the board, this connection. There is the faculty of hearing, the sense of hearing. Through the sense of hearing, we receive wahi. that is communicated to us by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam communicated the revelation of Quran through recitation. We perceive and have access to the revelation through the sense of hearing. Hearing is always given precedence over sight in the Quran. Sama' is always mentioned before basar in the Quran. It takes precedence over seeing, because a person who can hear the revelation. The person who is seeing but cannot hear will have a more difficult time. Of course, reading is an option. So there's a connection between hearing as the sense faculty, revelation, and what is conveyed in revelation. What hukum is given in revelation? The hukum shar'i, the legal judgment. If we go now to the second on the list, we have the second sense, the sense of sight. And the sight is the means, this is the faculty, sense perception, that by which we observe the patterns around us. And that is what judgment? The hukum adi. The hukum adi is established through observation. And now we go to the last one, the hukum aqli, the rational judgment. And the sense organ for that is called the fu'ad. It could also be called the qalb, the heart. And that is aql. And that is how we understand the hukum aqli, the rational judgment. So there's a connection here between our external senses and the internal organ of the heart, which is not the physical heart, but it is the organ of perception. Now, I alluded to this earlier, and I want to mention it more explicitly here. The aql judgment, the rational judgment, does not depend on the hukum adi or the hukum shar'i. In order for you to say that 1 + 1 = 2, do you require, before you can affirm that, do you require a verse of Quran? Are you dependent on a verse of Quran or a hadith before you affirm that 1 + 1 = 2? No. It does not depend on a hukum shar'i. It doesn't depend on revelation to make that affirmation. Likewise, when you say 1 + 1 = 2, do you have to observe that in a laboratory setting and test it out and observe before you can make that judgment? No. It doesn't depend on ada either. It doesn't depend on empirical observation. And this is why Ibn Ashir, he says in his beginning text, his text on Aqidah, وَحُكْمُنَا الْعَقْلِي قَضِيَّةٌ بِلَا وَقْفٍ عَلَى عَادَةٍ أَوْ وَضْعٍ جَلَى. He says that the rational judgment is the judgment which doesn't rely on revelation, and it doesn't rely on observation or experimentation. So there are three separate categories. We can't mix them together. It's not required for there to be a proof in Quran and Sunnah to affirm that 1 + 1 = 2, or that a square circle is absurd. It doesn't depend on a laboratory setting to say that 1 + 1 = 2, and so on. What does the hukum aqli do, or what is the function of the aqd? The function, we said, is not through revelation and it's not through experimentation. The focus or the purpose of the aql is to make judgments about essences, attributes, qualities, states, modes of being, whether things are or are not. Pretty much everything that we judge is falling under one of these, the rational judgment, right? So all of the different ways we conceive And we're going to talk about the categories of the hukum aqli in the next class. I'll break it down very briefly in today's class. The hukum aqli, the rational judgment, is, as we said, a condition for being accountable. If a person does not have the aql, they're not legally accountable. For you as a person to be mukallaf, to be legally accountable in the sight of Allah, you have to have the intellectual faculty, you have to attain the age of discernment, of puberty, and the message must have reached you. If you have all three of these together, you are accountable. And if you're lacking one of these, you're not accountable in Sharia. So, the rational judgment is three categories. There's three types of judgments that we can make about anything, rationally speaking. That thing is either rationally necessary, it has to be, or it's rationally impossible, it cannot be, or it is rationally possible. It can be, or it may not be. It could be either or. Both are equally plausible. And in the next class, we're going to talk about these three in detail, and we're going to go through lots of examples. I'm going to throw a lot of things at you, and you have to tell me whether they're rationally possible, impossible, necessary. And what I want to leave you with in the end of class today is that these three rational judgments, rationally possible, impossible, or rationally necessary, are not dependent on induction or research or reading into them. Meaning, there was not a set of scholars in ancient history who read a lot of books and studied lots of different things and said, well, we have discovered through our research that there are three rational judgments. That's not what it is. It's a rational judgment in itself, because there's no fourth category. Things either are necessary, impossible, or neither this one nor that one. They're possible. Could there be a fourth category? Could there be? Like 1 + 1 = 2. Rationally necessary. A square circle, rationally impossible. What did I put on the board here? A what? A blue cat. Is a blue cat rationally impossible? Is it rationally impossible? No. Is it rationally necessary? No. It's possible. Could be. Could be.
Are you saying rationally possible is not blue cat? Because rationally back there is not a 100%, like all the words you wrote down by 10 bucks. So blue cat doesn't fit in that category, right?
Yeah. Well, it's possible. Your mind can conceive of it. It's rationally possible. Is there a possible fourth category? Necessary, impossible, possible. The possible is neither this nor that. It's not necessary nor impossible. There's no fourth category. There can't be. And Imam al-Juwayni, I'll leave you with this. This is a little story to tell you. Imam al-Juwayni, known as Imam al-Haramain, he was one of the greatest scholars of his age, and he was the teacher of Imam al-Ghazali. And Imam al-Ghazali even surpassed his own teacher eventually. Imam al-Juwayni has a really famous saying about the rational judgments. He says that if a person doesn't know these rational judgments of rationally necessary, rationally impossible, and rationally impossible, they are not considered among the uqala. They're not considered sane people. It's his way of saying if you don't know these three, you're just majnoon. You're not among the sane people. And it's kind of an extreme statement because some people may not be familiar with the language. So if you talk to them about these things, they may get confused and mix things up. It's just because they're not familiar with the language. If you break it down, they intuitively know that a thing must be, or it cannot be, or it might be, or might not be. Just any average human being, they don't have to be intelligent even. It's not something, Aqeedah is not restricted to people who are at some super high IQ. It's basic intellectual principles we understand intuitively. However, I'll tell you a story. I was having a discussion one time with someone many years ago, and we were talking about some matter of Aqeedah, and they were talking some nonsense. So I asked this person, I said, this thing you're saying, are you saying, please tell me, is what you're saying in the category of rationally necessary, rationally impossible, or possible? This person responded by saying, none of the above. Neither necessary, nor impossible, nor possible. I said, well, what category are you talking about then? If it's none of those three, which one could it be? And his answer was, none of the above, Quran and Sunnah. So, okay. The fact that you don't even understand these categories, Imam Juwaini might have something to say about you. Maybe he wouldn't consider you among the sane. But I'm happy to report many years later that this person has come to his senses and realized that was not a very wise and smart thing to say. But the point I'm making is people, they don't learn how to think, so they say these kinds of things without fully understanding what they're saying. They don't know the implications of what they're saying. To say that there's some fourth category that supersedes what is rationally necessary, possible, or impossible is so absurd on the face of it that anyone who learns these categories in a systematic way will just, like that cartoon of Bart Simpson crawling back into the bushes, like doesn't want to be a part of this. So inshallah, with this I hope there's some value in it for you. You have a question? It's okay to be confused because it's not that you don't understand these things. You all understand these things, but the language in which it's presented is new to you. The terms are new, so trying to make sense of the terms based on your own intuitive understanding, that connection takes some time. Rationally possible.
But how can something be rationally possible if you've never observed heaven? You know what I mean? Like, I can't conceive of what.
I love the way you worded the question because it ties right back into what we were saying. Can you repeat it? How can you say it's rationally possible when it has not been observed? So we said that the definition of the rational judgment is that it doesn't depend on observation. It's like saying, how do we know that 1 + 1 is 2 unless we observe it? It doesn't depend on the observation with our physical senses because it's a rational category. You can conceive rationally of a person traveling through the heavens, can you not? Just your rational mind, you can conceive of it. You can imagine it. The observation is empirical judgment. That's the scientific judgment, the empirical judgment based on observation, using the senses.
But your mind, you said, for it to be possible, your mind can conceive it. So for my mind to be able to conceive of heaven, I have to know heaven. I have to know what it looks like. Right?
You don't have to know what it looks like. You can, if you're talking about the heavens, we could say that, okay, there's an empirical observation that there's space. We observe that empirically. saying that a person can travel through space, is that possible or impossible scientifically, based on our observation and our past experience with putting people through space? Empirically, we'd say that's impossible because, well, we haven't done it. And based on the current laws of physics, we know that's not possible to do. But can the mind's eye conceive of a person traveling through space? We can conceive of it, even if we admit that scientifically, based on our technology and what we know now, we couldn't do that. We couldn't send someone into space and it wouldn't be possible. But rationally speaking, it's possible.
Sorry, when you say send somebody in space, you mean without any equipment?
Without equipment.
Yeah, because, Star Trek.
Well, Star Trek, right. Right.
People, their space travel, it's perceived, but we know that you need equipment, you need all these things to make it possible.
Unaided by technology and returning in the same night, because there's a lot more to the Isra and the Mi'raj than just the journey. It's also the return. Look up Einstein's twin thought experiment. If you've seen the movie Interstellar, it shows up in the movie where the father goes into space to look for another planet, and for him it's not that long. He's still 6 months older, a year older after the fact. He returns to the space station, and his young daughter is now 75 years old on her deathbed. That's based on Einstein's thought experiment about space travel because of the relativity of time. That if you have two twins, they're both 15 years old. One of them goes into space and the other one remains on the earth. The one who remains on earth is here. So what is 1 year of time for him, because how do you measure time? There's no sunrise, sunset. That person returns, and the twin brother is now 85 years old, 100 years old. He's 15 and a half. But the Prophet ﷺ went on the Isra and Mi'raj and returned, and everybody was the same, and the bed was still warm. So there's a lot more going on than just even Einstein's theory, right? But the thing is, the mind can conceive of it as possible. We don't say that traveling through the heavens, unaided by technology, is as absurd as a square circle. You can conceive of it, but you can't conceive of a square circle as an actual thing, right? But we have to be careful in our language here too, because when we say observe in the mind's eye or conceive, you could try to conceive of a square circle. Like you may try to draw a picture in your mind. It won't work, but you can try. But we're talking, does that square circle have any extra mental existence? Does it exist outside of our minds? No, it couldn't. The two terms are contradicting each other. When we say rationally impossible, it means that the term A is contradicting B and B contradicts A. They're mutually contradictory. Square is by definition four-sided. A circle has no sides. So to say a square circle is to say a four-sided thing that has no sides. It's just word salad. It's rationally absurd. That's not the same thing as a person conceivably, rationally speaking, traveling through the heavens and returning. There's no contradiction in that in the mind's eye. But we're going to go through those individually in the next class. Today was really a breakdown of the Hukm Adi for the most part, and then a little bit about the Hukm Adi, Hukm Aqli, and why it's important. Next class, inshallah, we're going to look at what is rationally necessary, what is rationally possible, what is possible, how do we determine that, and look at many different examples like the one you mentioned and the ones we mentioned and more. So in the meantime, because we have 2 weeks to go, I want you to think about, you can even make a list ahead of time. Think about things that are rationally necessary, and think of things that are rationally impossible, you don't have to worry about things that are rationally possible because we observe that all around us. But these two are particularly important. If you could come up with 4 or 5 things for each, we'll go over them in class. And
First is rationally necessary.
rationally impossible. Mustahil and wajib. The better you get at understanding these categories, the more ease you have in grasping what is necessary and what is impossible, rationally speaking, the easier it is when you study theology, because you get used to thinking in this way, of looking at what the mind can conceive of as possible, impossible, or necessary. This is, some people really love this kind of stuff. They nerd out on it. Other people don't like it. But once you go through it and take it as your own, you'll understand a lot about the world around you with more clarity, and it becomes easier to study these things. Khair. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, so I was trying to keep that vague because that actually comes later on in the text. When we go into the poem, we list out the beliefs, the core essential beliefs that we have as Muslims, and then we talk about the rational proofs and textual proofs in the Quran and Sunnah. And when we talk about the rational proofs for the existence of Allah Ta'ala, we actually start by looking at the nature of the world and the fact that it undergoes change and that everything has a beginning. And everything that has a beginning requires someone who originated it. And that originator cannot have the same qualities as the creation, because that would mean there's a somewhat elaborate rational argument there called the Kalam cosmological argument. So you could put a placeholder on that question. So the observation is based on the aql. Though we haven't observed it, we make a rational judgment. The simple answer would be infinite regress is impossible. Infinite regress of past events, tasalsul, is rationally impossible, because it's like saying it would take you an infinite number of miles to reach Washington, D.C. from here. When do you reach Washington, D.C.? Would you ever reach it? You would never reach it, because you go a billion trillion miles, there's always more miles to go. So you never actually arrive. So we observe that the world exists. We know that we exist. We observe the change around us. We know that this had a beginning. It has been originated by a creator. That creator cannot have the same qualities as creation, because it would mean that he requires an originator as well. That originator cannot have the same qualities either, because that would mean that he requires an originator, and going on into infinity. So if that was the case, then the world wouldn't exist. The world wouldn't exist. But don't worry, we're going to go through that in like a whole class, maybe even 2 classes, just on that argument alone, when we look at the rational proof for Allah's existence.
Can you say again when you were saying what was the purpose? Or when you were explaining purpose of the intellect? Can you say again? Which you said that
Yeah.
making judgment about mostly everything around the
Yeah, so we're going to be repeating all of these things multiple times. I know it's a lot to take in. If this class was once a week, we could probably make it more digestible. The aql engages in something called tasawwur. We conceptualize. We basically observe and make certain judgments based on judgments about essences, attributes, qualities, states, different modes of being, what is not, what can, what cannot be, what might be or might not be. whether it's affirming something or negating it, really, there's nothing, no judgment that we make that escapes the aql. So the judgment that this phone is going to drop, obviously that's an empirical judgment. But predicting that it's going to happen, to say that it must happen or might happen or cannot happen, well, that's a rational judgment. The rational judgment is that it might happen, but it's not necessary that it has to happen, nor is it impossible for it to happen. That's a rational judgment. So we use the rational judgments in even day-to-day things. But again, it's a passive faculty, it's not active. It's like eyesight. You're perceiving the world around you through this filter of the aql, and you make these judgments. And sometimes, in here, I didn't go into it, but I'll leave you with it. When we talk about rational judgments, there's two types. There is what we call daruri and what we call nadari. Daruri is self-evident, meaning you don't have to think about it. 1 + 1 = 2. Do you have to think about that? Do you have to get out pen and paper and write that out to understand that 1 + 1 = 2? You don't. A square circle is rationally impossible. Now, do you have to spend 10 minutes thinking about that? No. That's daruri, it's self-evident. But then you have rational judgments that are nadari. They're the majority. They require some contemplation. You have to think about them. 1 + 1 + 10 - 7 × 5 + 4. If you get out a calculator or work it out on paper, you can arrive at that judgment, but you can't arrive at it like that unless you're some math whiz. For most people, that requires some thought. Most rational judgments are of that category. And this means that when we're talking about rational judgments, it's not expected for us to grasp them like this. We have to think about the premises and understand what is being said and build one on the other and look at the conclusion and give it some thought. And that's the purpose of talking the stuff out and learning it in this fashion. Khair.
Doesn't rely on observations, right?
Pardon?
Rational judgment does not rely on observations and revelation.
Yeah, when we say it doesn't rely on observation, we mean it doesn't depend on an experiment. It doesn't depend on you being blind, having vision or having hearing. If you're blind, you can still arrive at the understanding that 1 + 1 = 2. If you're deaf, you can still understand it. It doesn't depend on external phenomena in the created world because it's in the rational mind. Right? طيب والله ورسوله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين جزاك الله خير. We're going to review a lot of this stuff, so I don't want you to feel like we're rushing through anything. If you want to go through this again, we can go through it again.